Imagine it's June 1942. The Pacific theater of World War II is in full swing. Just 6 months after Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and a month following the Battle of the Coral Sea, the U.S. Navy is gearing up for a crucial encounter. Admirals Chester W. Nimitz, Frank J. Fletcher, and Raymond A. Spruance are leading the charge against Japan's fleet, commanded by Admirals Isoroku Yamamoto, Shuichi Nagumo, and Nobutake Kondo, near Midway Atoll. The stakes are incredibly high, and the outcome will be pivotal. Following the bold Doolittle air raid on Tokyo, Japanese leaders crafted a plan to extend their defensive perimeter by targeting Midway, Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii. Their goal was to trap the American aircraft carriers. However, their strategy suffered from poor planning and wrong guesses about how the Americans would react. Thanks to the brilliance of U.S. cryptographers, who cracked the Japanese codes, the U.S. Navy knew exactly when and where the attack would come. This allowed them to set their own ambush. The battle saw 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, facing off against 3 American carriers. By the end of the battle, all 4 Japanese carriers and the heavy cruiser Mikuma were sunk. The U.S. lost the carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond, but the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet remained fully operational. Midway, coupled with the grueling Solomon Islands campaign, severely crippled Japan's ability to replace lost ships and experienced personnel. In contrast, the United States, with its vast industrial and training resources, could more easily make up for its losses. Thus, the Battle of Midway, alongside the Guadalcanal campaign, marked a significant turning point in the Pacific War. Background. When Japan expanded its campaign in the Pacific, it quickly achieved its initial goals, taking control of British Hong Kong, the Philippines, British Malaya, Singapore, and the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Planning for the next phase began as early as January 1942. Due to disagreements between the Japanese Army and Navy, and internal conflicts, a new strategy wasn't developed until April 1942. Admiral Yamamoto won this struggle by threatening to resign, leading to the adoption of his Central Pacific Plan. Yamamoto aimed to eliminate America's carrier forces, which he saw as the biggest threat. The urgency increased after the Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, when 16 bombers from the USS Hornet hit Tokyo, exposing Japan's vulnerability. The U.S. carriers proved they were still a threat through successful raids in the South Pacific, though they avoided full-scale battles. Yamamoto believed another attack on Pearl Harbor would force the U.S. fleet, including its carriers, into open battle. However, the increased American air power in Hawaii made this too risky. Instead, Yamamoto targeted Midway, a small atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Oahu. While not crucial in Japan's broader strategy, they believed the U.S. would see Midway as vital to Pearl Harbor's defense and fight hard to keep it. The U.S. indeed considered Midway important and used it as a submarine and seaplane base, extending operational range significantly after the battle. Yamamoto's plan for Midway, called Operation Me, was complex and needed precise coordination across the ocean. He believed only the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet were available to the Pacific Fleet, as USS Lexington had been sunk and USS Yorktown was heavily damaged at the Coral Sea. However, Yorktown was quickly repaired and played a key role at Midway. Japanese leaders wrongly thought American morale was low due to their recent victories. Yamamoto planned to deceive the U.S. fleet by spreading his forces, keeping the extent of his battleships hidden. His main fleet trailed Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers by several hundred miles, intending to join the fight after the carriers weakened the U.S. forces. However, the Americans had broken Japan's naval code and knew many details of the plan. The spread-out Japanese forces couldn't support each other effectively. Nagumo's carriers, tasked with striking Midway, were guarded by a small screening force. Yamamoto and Kondo's supporting ships were too far to assist, reducing their combat effectiveness. To gain the Army's support for Midway, the Navy agreed to assist in the Aleutian Islands invasion, part of Alaska. This move aimed to keep Japanese home islands out of U.S. bomber range. The Aleutian operation diverted more ships that could have supported Midway. Operation Al in the Aleutians was meant to coincide with Midway but started a day earlier due to delays in Nagumo's task force, affecting Japanese coordination. Prelude. In preparation for the expected confrontation with a formidable Japanese force, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz needed every available flight deck. At his disposal was Vice Admiral William Halsey's 2-carrier task force, consisting of the Enterprise and Hornet. However, due to Halsey falling ill with shingles, Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance took command in his place. Nimitz also called back Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's task force from the Southwest Pacific area, including the carrier Yorktown. Yorktown had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea and was initially expected to need several months of repairs. Despite this, the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard managed to get her battle ready in just 72 hours, focusing on patching the flight deck and replacing critical internal structures. Repairs continued even as she set out, with work crews from the repair ship USS Vestal still on board. Yorktown's air group had to be quickly rebuilt using available planes and pilots. Bombing 3, VB-3, from USS Saratoga replaced Scouting 5, Versus 5, and Torpedo 3, VT-3, took the place of Torpedo 5, VT-5. Fighting 3, VF-3, was reconstituted with a mix of pilots from VF-42 and VF-3 under the command of Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch. Despite these efforts, the air group faced challenges, including an accident that killed Thatch's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Donald Lovelace. Saratoga, undergoing repairs on the West Coast, couldn't reach Midway in time for the battle due to the need for resupply and escort assembly. On Midway, the U.S. Navy stationed 4 squadrons of PBYs, 31 aircraft in total, for long-range reconnaissance, along with 6 new Grumman TBF Avengers from Hornets VT-8 by June 4. The Marine Corps stationed 19 Douglas SBD Dauntless, 7 F-4 F-3 Wildcats, 17 Vought SB-2U Vindicators, and 21 Brewster F-2A Buffaloes. The USAF contributed a squadron of 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 4 Martin B-26 Marauders equipped with torpedoes, making a total of 122 aircraft. Although the F-2As and SB-2Us were outdated, they were the only planes available to the Marine Corps at the time. During the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese faced significant losses. The light carrier Shoho was sunk, and the fleet carrier Shokaku suffered severe damage, requiring months of repairs. Although the fleet carrier Zuikaku wasn't damaged, she had lost nearly half her air group and was in port awaiting new planes and pilots. Unfortunately, the Japanese Navy couldn't train pilots fast enough to replace those lost in action. As a result, instructors from the Yokosuka Air Corps were reassigned to fill the gaps. Historians Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully suggest that by combining the surviving aircraft and pilots from Shokaku and Zuikaku could have almost had a full air group. However, this would have gone against Japanese carrier doctrine, which emphasized that carriers and their air groups trained together as a single unit. Unlike the American practice of interchangeable air squadrons, the Japanese didn't make serious efforts to prepare Zuikaku for the upcoming battle. As a result, Vice Admiral Nagumo had only 2/3 of the fleet carriers at his disposal, Kaga and Akagi in Carrier Division 1, and Hiryū and Sōryū in Carrier Division 2. These carriers had been on continuous operations since December 7, 1941, including raids on Darwin and Colombo. Despite this, the 1st Carrier Strike Force sailed with 248 aircraft across the 4 carriers, 60 on Akagi, 74 on Kaga, 57 on Hiryū, and 57 on Sōryū. The main Japanese carrier-borne strike aircraft were the Aichi D-3A-1 Val dive bomber and the Nakajima B-5N2 Kate, used as both torpedo and level bombers. Their main fighter was the fast and maneuverable Mitsubishi A-6M0. However, production of the Val had been drastically reduced, and the Kate production had stopped completely, leaving no replacements for losses. Many aircraft had been operational since late November 1941 and, despite being well maintained, were worn out and unreliable. This resulted in fewer aircraft than normal on the carriers, with limited spares and parts available. Nagumo's carrier force also had defensive weaknesses. Their anti-aircraft guns and fire control systems were inadequate, and their Fleet Combat Air Patrol, CAP, had too few fighters and lacked an effective early warning system, including radar. Poor radio communications hindered effective command and control of the CAP. Additionally, the escorting warships were deployed as visual scouts at long range rather than close anti-aircraft escorts, lacking the training, doctrine, and sufficient anti-aircraft guns for close support. Japanese strategic scouting before the battle was disorganized. A picket line of submarines was late getting into position, allowing American carriers to reach their assembly point northeast of Midway without being detected. Another reconnaissance attempt using H-8K Emily flying boats to scout Pearl Harbor failed when Japanese submarines found the refueling point occupied by American warships. Consequently, Japan had no information on American carrier movements just before the battle. Japanese radio intercepts did pick up increased American submarine activity and message traffic. This information was available to Yamamoto before the battle, but he assumed Nagumo had received the same signals and did not communicate directly to avoid revealing his position. Despite receiving these messages, Nagumo did not change his plans or take extra precautions for reasons that remain unclear. Admiral Nimitz had a crucial edge, U.S. cryptanalysts had partially cracked the Japanese Navy's JN-25B code. Since early 1942, U.S. codebreakers had been intercepting messages about an operation at a place called AF. Initially, they didn't know where AF was. However, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo figured it out with a clever trick. Captain Wilfred Holmes suggested telling Midway to send an uncoded radio message stating that its water purification system was broken. Within 24 hours, the Japanese sent a message saying AF is short on water, confirming that AF was indeed Midway. Surprisingly, the Japanese didn't suspect this as a trick, even though it was an uncoded message about a major base close to Japan. Hypo also pinpointed the date of the attack as either June 4 or 5 and provided Nimitz with the full Japanese order of battle. Japan had a new codebook, but its introduction was delayed, giving Hypo time to read crucial messages. The new code came into use on May 24, but by then, the essential breaks had already been made. This allowed the US to enter the battle with detailed knowledge of the Japanese plans. Nimitz knew that the Japanese had divided their fleet into 4 separate groups, which couldn't support each other effectively. This meant fewer fast ships were available to protect the carrier striking force, reducing the anti-aircraft defense around the carriers. Nimitz calculated that the aircraft on his 3 carriers, plus those on Midway Island, gave the US a rough parity with Yamamoto's 4 carriers, mainly because American carrier air groups were larger than the Japanese ones. The Japanese, on the other hand, remained largely unaware of the true strength and positions of the American forces even after the battle began. Battle. On the morning of June 3, around 9 a.m., Ensign Jack Reed, flying a PBY patrol plane from U.S. Navy Squadron VP-44, spotted the Japanese occupation force about 500 nautical miles southwest of Midway. Mistakenly thinking it was the main force, he reported it as such. At 12:30 p.m., 9 B-17 bombers took off from Midway for the first air attack. 3 hours later, they located Tanaka's transport group 570 nautical miles away. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, they dropped their bombs. Though crews reported hits on 4 ships, no bombs actually hit their targets, causing no significant damage. Early the next morning, around 1 a.m., the Japanese tanker Akebono Maru was hit by a torpedo from a PBY, marking the only successful air-launched torpedo attack by the U.S. during the entire battle. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4, Admiral Nagumo launched an attack on Midway, consisting of 36 DEA dive bombers, 36 B-5N torpedo bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. Simultaneously, 7 search planes took off to scout for the enemy. Midway's radar detected the approaching aircraft, prompting an immediate scramble of interceptors. The initial Japanese attack heavily damaged the U.S. base at Midway. Major Floyd B. Parks led a group of Marine fighters to intercept the attackers. Despite heavy losses, they managed to shoot down several Japanese planes. The Japanese, however, destroyed most of the U.S. fighters, leaving only 2 airworthy. In total, 108 Japanese aircraft participated in this attack, with 11 destroyed, 14 heavily damaged, and 29 sustaining some damage. Despite the damage, Midway's airbase remained operational, allowing American bombers to refuel and continue attacking the Japanese invasion force. Japanese pilots informed Nagumo that another attack on Midway's defenses would be necessary for a successful troop landing by June 7. Before the Japanese attack, American bombers based at Midway launched several strikes on the Japanese carrier force. These attacks involved 6 Grumman Avengers, 27 dive bombers, 4 B-26 bombers, and 15 B-17 bombers. The Japanese successfully repelled these attacks, losing only 3 Zero fighters while destroying numerous American aircraft. Major Lofton R. Henderson was among the dead, leading his squadron into action for the first time. The main airfield at Guadalcanal was later named in his honor. One notable B-26, piloted by Lieutenant James Murray, flew down the length of the Japanese carrier Akagi after dropping its torpedo, strafing the deck and killing 2 crew members. Another B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays, was heavily damaged and appeared to attempt a suicide run at Akagi's bridge, narrowly missing and crashing into the sea. This incident may have influenced Nagumo's decision to launch another attack on Midway, against orders to keep his reserve strike force ready for anti-ship operations. Meanwhile, the American submarine USS Nautilus, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Brockman, approached the Japanese fleet. Around 8:20 a.m., Nautilus made an unsuccessful torpedo attack on a battleship and dived to evade escorts. At 9:10 a.m., it launched another torpedo at a cruiser before diving again to avoid pursuit, with the destroyer Arashi spending considerable time chasing it. By early morning, June 4, 1942, Admiral Nagumo found himself in a tough spot. He had kept half of his planes in reserve, ready for different missions. These included dive bombers that were not yet armed and torpedo bombers equipped for attacking ships. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo ordered his reserve planes to be rearmed with general-purpose bombs to hit land targets after the first wave of attacks from Midway. This process was underway for about 30 minutes when, at 7:40 a.m., a delayed scout plane from the cruiser Tone reported sighting a large American force to the east. However, the report did not specify what type of ships were spotted. It's believed Nagumo received this message around 8 a.m. Nagumo quickly reversed his earlier order and instructed the bombers to be rearmed again with torpedoes. He also requested more details about the American fleet. It took another 20 to 40 minutes before the scout plane confirmed the presence of a single American carrier, one of the carriers from Task Force 16. The other carrier remained undetected. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, in charge of Carrier Division 2, advised Nagumo to attack immediately with the available aircraft, 16 dive bombers from Sōryū and 18 from Hiryū, supported by half of the combat air patrol planes. Nagumo's opportunity to strike the American ships was limited by the imminent return of his Midway strike force, which needed to land soon or risk ditching into the sea. Due to ongoing flight deck operations, the Japanese couldn't position their reserve planes for launch in time. By the time of the American attack, the few planes on Japanese flight decks were either defensive fighters or fighters being prepared to join the combat air patrol. Launching a full strike would have taken at least 30 minutes and risked sending out planes without proper anti-ship weapons or fighter escorts. Nagumo had just witnessed how easily unescorted American bombers were shot down. Japanese naval doctrine favored launching fully coordinated strikes rather than piecemeal attacks. Without confirmation of American carriers until 8:20 a.m., Nagumo decided to follow standard procedure. Additionally, another American air strike on Midway at 7:53 a.m. reinforced the need to attack the island again. Nagumo chose to wait for his first strike force to return and then launch a properly armed attack. If Nagumo had launched his available aircraft around 7:45 a.m., risking the ditching of his returning planes, he might have had a strong force capable of sinking 2 American carriers. Furthermore, fueled and armed planes inside the carriers posed a significant risk, making it safer to launch them. By that point, however, American planes were already on their way, having launched from their carriers starting at 7 a.m. Enterprise and Hornet completed launching by 7:55 a.m., while Yorktown finished at 9:08 a.m. Even if Nagumo had acted differently, he couldn't have stopped the American attack. The American forces had already launched their carrier aircraft against the Japanese. Admiral Fletcher, aboard the Yorktown and benefiting from early morning PBY sighting reports, ordered Spruance to launch the attack as soon as possible while keeping Yorktown in reserve in case other Japanese carriers were found. Spruance, despite the long range, decided a strike could succeed and gave the order. He left Halsey's chief of staff, Captain Miles Browning, to handle the details. The carriers needed to launch into the wind, so they steamed away from the Japanese at high speed. Browning suggested a launch time of 7 a.m., giving the carriers an hour to close in on the Japanese fleet, assuming it didn't change course. The first planes from Enterprise and Hornet took off shortly after 7 a.m. Fletcher followed suit at 8 a.m. from Yorktown after completing his own scouting flights. Fletcher and Yorktown's Captain Elliot Buckmaster had gained valuable experience in the Coral Sea, but there was no time to share these lessons with Captain George Murray of Enterprise and Captain Mark Mitcher of Hornet. Spruance ordered the attacking aircraft to proceed immediately rather than wait for the entire strike force to assemble, knowing that neutralizing the enemy carriers was crucial for his task force's survival. While the Japanese managed to launch 108 aircraft in just 7 minutes, it took Enterprise and Hornet over an hour to launch 117. Spruance believed that it was more important to keep the Japanese under continuous attack rather than coordinate different types of aircraft. As a result, American squadrons launched piecemeal, accepting higher casualties but impairing the Japanese ability to launch a counterstrike. American carrier aircraft struggled to find the Japanese fleet despite receiving position reports. The strike from Hornet, led by Commander Stanhope Ring, followed an incorrect heading and missed the Japanese carriers. Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, broke formation and followed the correct heading, attacking at 9:20 a.m. Without fighter escort, all 15 TBD Devastators of VT-8 were shot down without inflicting damage. Ensign George Gay was the sole survivor, launching his torpedo at Sōryū before being shot down, but Sōryū evaded it. VT-6 from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, lost 9 of its 14 Devastators, and 10 of 12 Devastators from Yorktown's VT-3 were shot down with no hits, partly due to the poor performance of their Mark 13 torpedoes. Midway marked the last combat use of the TBD Devastator. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, Flying Zeros, quickly shot down the slow, underarmed TBDs. Despite getting close to their targets, the torpedoes either missed or failed to explode. The performance of American torpedoes was poor, with many failing to detonate even when they hit the target. Despite the lack of hits, the torpedo attacks achieved three key results. They kept the Japanese carriers off balance, forced the cap out of position, and depleted the Zero's ammunition and fuel. A third torpedo plane attack from Yorktown's VT-3 drew the majority of the Japanese cap to the southeast quadrant of the fleet. At the same time, 3 squadrons of SBDs from Enterprise and Yorktown approached from the southwest and northeast. Yorktown's squadron, VB-3, followed VT-3 but attacked from a different angle. Enterprise's squadrons, VB-6 and Versus-6, running low on fuel, followed the wake of the Japanese destroyer Arashi, returning to Nagumo's carriers after chasing the U.S. submarine Nautilus. McCluskey's decision to continue the search and follow Arashi's wake was pivotal. All 3 American dive bomber squadrons arrived almost simultaneously at the perfect time to attack. The Japanese cap was focused on the torpedo planes, leaving the carriers vulnerable. The Japanese carriers were caught in a vulnerable state, with fueled aircraft on deck, fuel hoses, and ordnance scattered around, making them prime targets for the American bombers. The destruction of Kaga, Sōryū, and Akagi. At 10:22 a.m., 2 squadrons from Enterprise's air group split up, aiming to attack Kaga and Akagi. A mix-up caused both squadrons to dive at Kaga. Realizing the mistake, Lieutenant Richard Best and his wingmen pulled out and targeted Akagi instead. Kaga faced a barrage from almost 2 entire squadrons, taking 3 to 5 direct hits that caused severe damage and multiple fires. 1 bomb struck near the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and many senior officers. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, part of McCluskey's group, described the scene. "We were diving on the port side of the carrier. I recognized her as Kaga. She was massive. The target was perfect. I saw a bomb hit right behind my aim point. The deck rippled, exposing the hangar below. My 500 pounds bomb hit near the island. The 100 pounds bomb struck forward among the parked planes. Minutes later, Best and his wingmen attacked Akagi. Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was on Akagi when it was hit. He recalled. A lookout screamed, 'Hell divers!' I saw 3 black enemy planes diving towards us. Some machine guns fired, but it was too late. The dauntless dive bombers released their bombs. Akagi was hit by 1 bomb, likely dropped by Best. The bomb struck the edge of the midship deck elevator and exploded among armed and fueled planes, causing devastating fires. Nagumo's chief of staff, Ryunosuke Kusaka, noted a horrific fire. Bodies everywhere. Planes in flames, black smoke billowing, making it impossible to control the fires. Another bomb exploded underwater near the stern, bending the flight deck and damaging the rudder. Simultaneously, Yorktown's VB-3, led by Lieutenant Max Leslie, targeted Sōryū, scoring 3 direct hits that caused massive damage. Gasoline ignited, creating an inferno, and stacked bombs and ammunition exploded. VT-3 went for Hiryū but missed, as it was surrounded by Sōryū, Kaga, and Akagi. In just 6 minutes, Sōryū and Kaga were engulfed in flames, burning from bow to stern. Akagi, though hit by only 1 bomb, eventually succumbed to spreading fires. Despite Nagumo's reluctance, Kusaka convinced him to abandon Akagi. At 10:46 a.m., Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. Initially, there was hope to save or tow Akagi back to Japan, but all 3 carriers were eventually abandoned and scuttled. While Kaga burned, the submarine Nautilus launched 3 torpedoes, scoring 1 dud hit. Kaga was later sunk by the destroyer Hajikase. Japanese counterattacks. Hiryū, the last operational Japanese aircraft carrier, quickly launched a counterattack. The first wave from Hiryū included 18 DEA dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters. They followed the retreating American planes and soon spotted Yorktown, hitting her with 3 bombs. These strikes caused significant damage, creating a hole in the deck, knocking out all but one of her boilers, and destroying an anti-aircraft mount. The damage was severe enough to force Admiral Fletcher to relocate his command to the heavy cruiser Astoria. However, the damage control teams worked efficiently, managing to patch the flight deck and restore power to several boilers within an hour. This allowed Yorktown to resume operations at 19 knots. Displaying resilience, Yorktown signaled a speed of 5 knots and hoisted a large new American flag on the foremast. 13 DEAs and 3 Zeros were lost in this attack, with 2 Zeros turning back early after being damaged while attacking Enterprise's returning SBDs. An hour later, Hiryū launched a second wave, consisting of 10 B-5N torpedo bombers and 6 Zero escorts. When they arrived over Yorktown, the repairs were so effective that the Japanese pilots mistook her for a different, undamaged carrier. This wave attacked, hitting Yorktown with 2 torpedoes, causing her to lose all power and list 23 degrees to port. In this attack, 5 B-5NS and 2 Zeros were shot down. The news of these strikes, with the erroneous belief that they had sunk 2 American carriers, boosted Japanese morale. The few surviving aircraft were recovered on Hiryū, and despite heavy losses, the Japanese believed they could muster enough planes for one more strike against what they thought was the last American carrier. American counterattack on Hiryū. Hiryū, the last operational Japanese carrier, didn't waste time in launching a counterattack. Late in the afternoon, a scout plane from Yorktown spotted Hiryū, prompting Enterprise to launch a final strike of 24 dive bombers. Despite being defended by a strong cover of Zero fighters, the attack was successful, with 4 bombs hitting Hiryū, leaving her ablaze and unable to operate aircraft. A communications error delayed Hornet's strike, which then focused on the remaining escort ships but failed to score any hits. Dusty Clyce, a dive bomber from Enterprise, struck Hiryū on the bow, crippling her. As efforts to control the fire failed, most of Hiryū's crew were evacuated. Despite a scuttling attempt by a Japanese destroyer, Hiryū stayed afloat for several more hours. The next morning, an aircraft from the escort carrier Hosho found her, raising hopes of saving the ship. However, soon after being spotted, Hiryū sank. Yamaguchi, along with the ship's captain, chose to go down with the ship, a significant loss for Japan. As night fell, both sides took stock and made plans for the next day. Fletcher, forced to abandon the damaged Yorktown, passed command to Spruance. Spruance, aware of the victory but cautious about remaining Japanese forces, continued to safeguard both Midway and his carriers. He kept closing in on Nagumo during the day and persisted as night fell. Fearing a night encounter with Japanese surface forces and believing Yamamoto still planned to invade, Spruance withdrew eastward, then turned back west at midnight. Yamamoto, initially deciding to continue the engagement, sent his remaining forces eastward to find the American carriers. He also detached a cruiser force to bombard Midway. However, Spruance's brief withdrawal and Yamamoto's decision to retire prevented a direct clash. On 5th of June, despite extensive searches, Spruance couldn't re-establish contact with Yamamoto's forces. In the afternoon, he launched a search and destroy mission, narrowly missing Yamamoto's main body and failing to hit a straggling destroyer. The strike planes returned after nightfall, and Spruance ordered Enterprise and Hornet to turn on their lights to aid landings. Early on 5th of June, Commander John Murphy's submarine Tambor spotted several ships but couldn't identify them. Murphy's vague report frustrated Spruance, providing little concrete information. Mistaking the ships for the main invasion force, Spruance moved to block them while staying northeast of Midway. In reality, the ships were part of Yamamoto's detachment sent to bombard Midway. During maneuvers to avoid a submarine attack, the cruisers Mogami and Makuma collided, severely damaging Mogami. The damaged ships became prime targets for American attacks over the next 2 days. Makuma was eventually sunk, while Mogami survived but was heavily damaged. Marine aviator Captain Richard E. Fleming, killed during an attack on Makuma, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Meanwhile, salvage efforts on Yorktown were promising until the Japanese submarine I-168 slipped through the destroyer cordon and fired torpedoes. 2 struck Yorktown, and a third hit the destroyer Hammond, causing it to sink with significant loss of life. With further salvage efforts deemed hopeless, Yorktown's remaining crew was evacuated. The ship stayed afloat until 7 June, when she finally capsized and sank. Japanese and U.S. casualties. As the battle drew to a close, the toll on both sides became evident. Norman Dusty Clyce, an SBD pilot who scored hits on Kaga, Hiryū, and Makuma, reflected on the lessons learned from previous battles. He emphasized the need for better protection for torpedo bombers and more reliable torpedoes, citing their dismal performance. The Japanese losses were staggering. A total of 3,057 Japanese personnel perished. The 4 carriers alone accounted for a significant portion of these casualties. Akagi lost 267 men, Kaga 811, Hiryū 392, including Admiral Yamaguchi who chose to go down with his ship, and Sōryū 711, including Captain Yanagimoto who also stayed on board. This totaled 2,181 casualties among the carriers. Additionally, the heavy cruisers Makuma and Mogami suffered heavy losses. Makuma sank with 700 casualties, while Mogami, though badly damaged, accounted for another 92 deaths. The destroyers Arasho and Asashio, damaged during the air attacks that sank Makuma and further damaged Mogami, had 35 and 21 casualties respectively. The floatplanes lost from the cruisers Chikama and Tone added to the toll, as did the deaths aboard the destroyers Tanikaze, 11, Arashi, 1, and Kazagumo, 1, and the fleet oiler Akebono Maru, 10, making up the remaining 23 casualties. On the American side, the losses were also significant but far less severe in comparison. The U.S. lost the carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond. A total of 307 Americans were killed in the battle. Among the dead was Major General Clarence L. Tinker, commander of the 7th Air Force, who led a bomber strike against the retreating Japanese forces on 7 June and was killed when his aircraft crashed near Midway Island. Aftermath. Following their decisive victory at Midway, American forces found further pursuit near Wake Island too dangerous. Admiral Spruance withdrew to refuel his destroyers and rendezvous with the carrier Saratoga, which was bringing much-needed replacement aircraft. On 8 June, Admiral Fletcher transferred his command to Saratoga and resumed control of the carrier force. For the next 2 days, the carriers launched search missions to ensure the Japanese were not regrouping for another attack on Midway. By 10 June, the decision was made to leave the area, and the American carriers returned to Pearl Harbor. Historian Samuel E. Morrison noted that Spruance faced criticism for not chasing the retreating Japanese fleet, which allowed many of their ships to escape. Clay Blair argued that had Spruance pursued the Japanese, he would have faced significant risks. Launching aircraft after nightfall would have been impossible, and his cruisers could have been overwhelmed by Yamamoto's powerful surface units, including the battleship Yamato. Furthermore, the American air groups had suffered significant losses, particularly among their torpedo bombers, making them less effective against the Japanese battleships even if they had managed to engage them during daylight. Additionally, Spruance's destroyers were running critically low on fuel. On 10 June, the Imperial Japanese Navy provided an incomplete report to their military liaison, underplaying the extent of their defeat. Nagumo's detailed battle report, submitted to the High Command on 15 June, revealed that the Japanese believed their plans were undiscovered until the morning of 5 June. In reality, American code-breaking efforts had compromised the entire operation from the start. The Japanese public and much of their military command were kept unaware of the true extent of the defeat. Japanese news announced a significant victory, and only Emperor Hirohito and the highest Navy command were accurately informed of the carrier and personnel losses. This misinformation led the Imperial Japanese Army to believe, for a short time, that the fleet was still in good condition. When the Japanese fleet returned to Hashirajima on 14 June, the wounded were immediately transferred to naval hospitals and placed in isolation to keep the defeat secret. Surviving officers and men were quickly reassigned to other units, often without seeing family or friends, and sent to the South Pacific, where many died in subsequent battles. None of the flag officers or staff of the combined fleet faced penalties, and Nagumo was later put in command of the rebuilt carrier force, possibly because he reported sinking 2 American carriers instead of the actual one. The defeat at Midway prompted changes in Japanese procedures. Aircraft were now refueled and rearmed on the flight deck rather than in the hangars, and all unused fuel lines were drained. New carriers being built had only 2 flight deck elevators and improved firefighting equipment. More crew members were trained in damage control and firefighting, though the later losses of the carriers Shokaku, Hiyo, and Taiho suggested persistent issues. Replacement pilots were rushed through abbreviated training programs to meet immediate needs, leading to a decline in the quality of aviators. These inexperienced pilots were sent directly to frontline units, while the veterans from Midway and the Solomons campaign faced increased workloads without opportunities to rest in rear areas or at home. Consequently, Japanese naval air groups deteriorated over time, while their American counterparts continued to improve. American prisoners. During the Battle of Midway, 3 American aviators were captured, Ensign Wesley Osmus from Yorktown, and Ensign Frank O'Flaherty along with aviation machinist mate Bruno Peter Guido, both from Enterprise. Osmus was held aboard the destroyer Arashi, while O'Flaherty and Guido were taken to either the cruiser Nagara or the destroyer Mikigumo. Accounts vary on the exact location. O'Flaherty and Guido were interrogated before being killed by being tied to water-filled kerosene cans and thrown overboard to drown. Osmus faced a similarly brutal fate. When slated for execution, he resisted and was murdered with a fire axe on Arashi, after which his body was thrown overboard. Nagumo's official report briefly mentioned Osmus, stating that he died on 6 June and was buried at sea, but did not detail the fates of O'Flaherty and Guido. The execution of Osmus was reportedly ordered by Arashi's captain, Watanabe Yasumasa. Yasumasa later died when the destroyer Numika sank in December 1943. Had he survived, he would likely have faced trial as a war criminal for his actions during the battle. Japanese prisoners. 2 sailors from the cruiser Makuma were found on a life raft by USS Trout on June 9 and brought to Pearl Harbor. After receiving medical treatment, at least one of these men cooperated during interrogation and provided valuable intelligence. Additionally, on June 19, a group of 35 crew members from the carrier Hiryū was rescued from a lifeboat by USS Ballard. They were spotted by an American search plane and subsequently taken to Midway. From there, they were transferred to Pearl Harbor aboard USS Sirius. Impact. The turning point in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway is often hailed as the turning point of the Pacific War. It marked the Allies' first significant naval victory against Japan. Had Japan won as decisively as the US did, they might have captured Midway Island. This would have left Saratoga as the only American carrier in the Pacific until the end of 1942, as no new carriers were completed before then. Although the US likely wouldn't have sought peace as Yamamoto hoped, Japan could have revived plans to invade Fiji and Samoa, attacked Australia, Alaska, and Ceylon, or even tried to occupy Hawaii. While Japan continued efforts to secure more territory, the US did not achieve naval supremacy immediately. It took several more months of intense combat. However, the victory at Midway allowed the Allies to take the strategic initiative, leading to the Guadalcanal landings and the prolonged Solomon Islands campaign. This shift occurred before the new Essex-class fleet carriers became available at the end of 1942. Some historians also view the Guadalcanal campaign as a significant turning point in the Pacific War. Impact on the Japanese Navy. The heavy losses at Midway, including carriers and veteran aircrews, permanently weakened the Imperial Japanese Navy. While some argue that the loss of 110 veteran aircrew, just under 25% of the aircrew on the 4 carriers, was not crippling, the overall impact was severe. Japan lost 4 large fleet carriers, over 40% of their highly trained aircraft mechanics and technicians, essential flight deck crews, armorers, and organizational knowledge. Subsequent battles, like the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, further depleted Japan's experienced aircrew and operational capabilities. After Midway, Shokaku and Zuikaku were the only large carriers from the original Pearl Harbor strike force still afloat. Other Japanese carriers like Taiho, commissioned in early 1944, were among the few fleet carriers worth teaming with Shokaku and Zuikaku. In contrast, the U.S. commissioned more than 24 fleet and light fleet carriers and numerous escort carriers within the same timeframe. The U.S. had already been 3 years into a shipbuilding program mandated by the Second Vincent Act of 1938. Training and aircrew rotation. Both the U.S. and Japan accelerated aircrew training, but the U.S. had a more effective pilot rotation system. This allowed more veterans to survive and pass on their combat experience to new trainees. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japan had nearly rebuilt their carrier forces in numbers but struggled with inexperienced and poorly trained pilots flying many obsolete planes. Importance of cryptanalysis. Midway demonstrated the value of pre-war naval cryptanalysis and intelligence gathering, efforts that expanded throughout the war in both the Pacific and Atlantic theaters. These successes were numerous and significant, including the shooting down of Admiral Yamamoto's plane in 1943. Strategic consequences. The Battle of Midway forced Japan to abandon its plan to link up with Nazi Germany in the Indian subcontinent. It also redefined the importance of air superiority for the remainder of the war. The sudden loss of 4 main aircraft carriers meant Japan could no longer launch major offensives in the Pacific without air dominance. Discovery of sunken vessels. Due to the extreme ocean depth in the area where the Battle of Midway took place, over 17,000 feet, researching the battlefield has been incredibly challenging. On May 19, 1998, Robert Ballard, along with a team of scientists and veterans from both sides of the battle, located and photographed the wreck of the Yorktown. It was found 16,650 feet deep and was remarkably intact for a ship that had sunk in 1942. Much of the original equipment and paint scheme were still visible. However, Ballard's search for the Japanese carriers was unsuccessful. In September 1999, a joint expedition by Nauticos Corporation and the U.S. Naval Oceanographic Office set out to locate the Japanese carriers. Utilizing advanced renavigation techniques and the log of the submarine USS Nautilus, they found a significant piece of wreckage, identified as part of the upper hangar deck of the carrier Kaga. On October 18, 2019, the research vessel RV Petrel, in collaboration with the U.S. Navy, announced the discovery of the Japanese carrier Kaga, resting 17,700 feet below the surface. Just a few days later, on October 21, 2019, they confirmed the discovery of another Japanese carrier, the Akagi, found in the Paepahanamokuakia Marine National Monument at a depth of nearly 18,010 feet. Remembrances. Chicago Municipal Airport played a crucial role during World War II and was renamed Chicago Midway International Airport in 1949 to honor the Battle of Midway. Similarly, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal was named after Major Lofton Henderson, a United States Marine Corps aviator who was the first Marine to die in the battle. The escort carrier USS Midway, CVE-63, commissioned on August 17, 1943, was later renamed St. Lo to free up the name Midway for a larger fleet carrier. The USS Midway, CV-41, was commissioned on September 10, 1945, just after Japan's surrender, and is now a museum in San Diego, California. In recognition of the battle, Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt designated the Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge as the Battle of Midway National Memorial on September 13, 2000. Additionally, Tinker Air Force Base near Oklahoma City is named in honor of Major General Clarence L. Tinker, who led a bomber strike against Japanese forces on June 7, 1942. Director John Ford made 2 films about the battle, the 18-minute documentary The Battle of Midway, which won the 1942 Academy Award for Best Documentary, and Torpedo Squadron 8, an 8-minute film about the heroism of the squadron from the USS Hornet. Ford, a Navy Reserve commander, was present during the Japanese attack on Midway and filmed the action, sustaining a combat wound in his arm. As we wrap up this incredible journey through history, it's clear that the Battle of Midway was a pivotal moment that reshaped the course of World War II. The bravery and strategy displayed during these critical days left an indelible mark on our world. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most significant naval battles. Thanks for watching. This is The Animated General. Out.